Boy, I sure am red. Maybe with a little more light, I'll be a little less red. Now I'm more pink. That's better. Good morning. My name's host Eric. And I am the host of Talking with Famous People, the internet television program that's always broadcasting the truth wherever you are in the world, whatever time of day, except on Christmas. That's our rather cumbersome motto here at Talking with Famous People. I'm not going to try to dispute that it's a rather cumbersome motto. It is. Why words matter so much? Well, good morning, Jade. My central thesis here is, in some sense, they don't. That, in fact, it's when we focus on the people that we get it correct. That the reason, Jade, for example, was wrong, or maybe still is, she probably changed her position by now, I don't know. But the reason she's wrong is not because exactly of the words, but that she's sort of destined to be wrong forever because she's not in a subject matter that's conducive to being right with her cognitive function stack. Similarly, the meta-rationalist guy, right? The guy talks about meta-rationalism. The key thing that makes meta-rationalism a preferable approach is that it's not a totalizing dogma. So it's the only non-totalizing dogma there is. So it's like, when I'm dealing with Cloud, for example, Cloud is very determinedly anti-TI. He doesn't want definitions to be determinate. But of course, this is an area where definitions are determinate. It's the nature of the beast we're talking about, It's like, you may not want to use bait or a net or a fishing line to catch fish. You may want to use a rifle, but it's not a good means to use to catch fish, right? It's not the right approach for the environment. So the same thing is true with all of life, really, is that we have to understand why words mean what they do and how to avoid using them wrong if we want to be correct. But in certain circumstances, words are inappropriate. So, for example, in my relationship with Rachel, at the beginning of it, I was determined to use TI to establish the boundaries and everything of the relationship. Basically, these are the narratives we're going to agree on. And once we agree on these narratives, we're fine because then we know what the words are that we're going to adhere to. Of course, it's not a very smart way to approach a relationship. It's me trying to use a rifle to fish. It's not appropriate. But of course, when your TI tool, pretty much that's what you use for everything. You use your tool function for most everything that requires things of you. So the thing is this. When we look at the historical progression of philosophy, we start with modernism. Let's start there, okay? Modernism is the notion that we can, via application of principled reason, know what's correct. It's a totalizing worldview. It's a much preferable totalizing worldview to the one that followed postmodernism. Okay, postmodernism is a rejection of totalizing worldviews as a whole, including principalism. But of course, postmodernism collapses into moral relativism and cultural relativism, which are inherently disastrously bad. So, but the fundamental critique of modernism, that no matter how noble and principled the dogma, that it's still a totalizing dogma, is fundamentally correct. So how do you bridge this divide? On the one hand, you've got an appropriate critique of a modernist framework that provides principalism as a totalizing worldview. And it's an appropriate critique because, of course, any totalizing worldview is wrong. It leads to totalitarianism. It's saying we can always prefer this criterion over some other criterion when they conflict. Now, that's not how reality works. We can't always prefer one criterion over another criterion when they conflict. We have to be contextually nuanced. We have to be able to adjust criteria according to the context. And that's why words matter so much, If you can't accurately articulate why a given circumstance is conducive to a given approach, if you can't adequately articulate what that approach is and how it differs from other approaches, then you're not going to correctly articulate anything about anything, frankly, that requires TI, That has nothing to do with Occam's razor. Occam's razor says, let's not take a more complicated understanding when a simpler understanding is available. What I'm saying is something quite different. It's that totalizing worldviews are bad. For example, if you try to frame everything through Occam's razor, that would be silly. Nobody would even bother trying that, right? Because it's so obviously not something that you can totalize. But people don't have that same response towards everything else in general that is obviously not something that can be totalized, but they'll totalize it anyway. Make it the dominant criterion, which is why my point is really the only safe totalizing criterion is meta-rationalism, because it's specifically and expressively opposed to totalizing, but individual focused rather than argumentationally focused. There's nothing necessarily wrong with your specific arguments. What's wrong with your arguments is that they're representative of an inherent bias and inclination in the person that would have to be addressed if they're going to actually become meta-rationalists, namely not so attached to their specific positions about meow, 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 but rather attached to being holistically correct, which means rejecting your totalizing worldview sometimes, So anyway, there's this one guy. Yeah, I'm a person, right? So I understand that my approach is going to be wrong some context. Being able to identify those contexts where I'm not equipped to be correct is critically important to being an honest person, basically. It's saying, all right, I'm like everybody else. I have my areas where I'm not going to be correct too. That's the difference. Is people with totalizing worldviews don't understand necessarily that they too have areas where they're not correct. Like if you are a Muslim extremist, for example, you don't accept the notion that there are some areas in life where you can't filter shit through your religion, right? You just can't if you want to be correct. Email Anthrax, are you still playing No TI Guy? So when I think back again about the beginning of my relationship with Rachel, it is so absurd, the approach I try to take, saying, okay, well, let's first decide whether or not what our status is, and then let's behave as though that narrative were true, and that's the same thing as it being true. So I've decided I love you. It had nothing to do with my feelings or not, and therefore I say that, and you say that too, and we both act like people who are in love, and then that's it. That's how you attain actual love. Well, of course, that's silly. There's supposed to be feelings underneath the whole thing. There are no subtypes. Subtypes is bullshit. That's not a theory. That's just implicit to understanding what personality is. Namely, you can subdivide types into varieties of types. There are ENTPs who are nicer and ENTPs who are more dickish, for example. You could try to divide types into subtypes using an Enneagram. Okay, but Jade, everyone else gets this is not a warrant for anything. A lot of people agree with you in your wrongness is not a reason for me to agree with you in your wrongness. You need an actual good reason for that. Not just everybody says is not a reason for anything. Again, as a professional debate coach, I am not only stack-wise, function stack-wise, particularly good at this, I'm also professionally trained and especially good at this job I do too. Like, I'm not just a debate coach, I'm an especially good debate coach with national champions and shit, you know? Okay, well then that explains why you're here. That doesn't explain why we should listen to you. All right? That's a reason for a different warrant or a different claim. If we were disputing why you're here, if that were in any dispute, or if that were the subject, then your justification here would make sense logically as a response. But we're not disputing whether or not you're here for this reason or that, so it's irrelevant. Well, you should agree with subtypes being bullshit, because the only kind of subtypes that aren't bullshit are as if you're going to taxonomy the type in an arbitrary way. Mechanically, typology exists because of the implicit relations between kinds of functions: exclusivity, proportionality, and inverse proportionality. Jade, I don't want to learn to speak the language first, then I'll argue with you. There's no reason to think that subtypes could or would emerge from cognitive functions. It is reasonable to think that subtypes could and would emerge from Enneagram if you put weight into Enneagram. I am not somebody who defends Enneagram with TI because it's not sustainable with TI. I still like it. I still think it's a good system. I still think it explains things that cognitive functions don't explain. So it's true that I am an ENTP 7, and that's different than an ENTP 6, for example, or an ENTP 8, or an ENTP 5, you know? And I do think that one of the reasons why Rachel and I get along so well is not just a cognitive function thing. I think it's an Enneagram thing. We're both type 7s. We both like to play, and we both don't like having expectations put on us at all. So that works out really well for us. And that's not having to do with MBTI. And it is having to do with something that you could call a subtype of MBTI, which is Enneagram type. But it's not, that would be an inaccurate name for it. It's not really a subtype of MBTI at all. It's instead a different factor that is in play. ESTP7. Do you want me to put my hair on again? I would put my ESTP hair on again if you're not careful. Okay, so Jay, let's talk about argumentation a bit. Your claim here is that subtypes are absolutely linked to cognitive functions, and they have nothing to do with Enneagram. And your warrant is that Enneagram has wings, so the two numbers before and after it affect it. First of all, I don't ascribe to the wing ideas of Enneagram. I ascribe to the tri-type notion of Enneagram, which is a better idea and makes more inherent sense. Wings don't make much sense because I'm a 7, 8, 4 tri-type, which means if I have wings, it's probably 7 wing 8, 8 wing 7. That doesn't make any sense. So, I mean, it's pretty easy to dismiss wings right away as kind of not very meaningful. But it's not so easy to dismiss tri-type right away. And in fact, we do see that tri-types are, you know, one of the best descriptions of ENTP I've ever read was actually a Naranjo description of type 7 Enneagram. So there's definitely something there. But again, it's not something that I have a full TI understanding of, so I don't tend to argue it. Well, Jade, that's because I'm using logic to make my decisions, and you're using your feelings. So in other words, what you decide is true is links to what you want to be true, whereas what I decide is true is what I link to what is most sustainable argumentationally, a TI standard. So naturally, we're going to be in stark disagreement about a lot of things. I mean, even if you were right about me and I was an ESTP, that would be the case. No, you're not an INFJ, Jade. That's very obvious. I've dealt with so many INFJs around here, actual ones. It's extremely obvious you're not an INFJ. Like, beat you over the head with a 2x4 obvious. There's no chance in hell. INFJs and I inherently get along, first of all, but that's not a good reason to conclude that. It's just your approach to communication is not indicative of all of NIFE. Okay, well, I'm sure you do believe that wholeheartedly, and it'd probably be impossible to change your mind. That goes along with FI Tool. I mean, that's just how it goes. I've argued with ESFPs till I'm blue in the face, like Brittany. And of course, ESFPs tend to be convinced they're INFJs, ENTPs, or INTPs, or INTJs. Like, they want to be they want to be a fancy type or something, right? Rarely do I type an ESFP who's happy enough with being an ESFP. Almost always they come in convinced there's some thinking type or something else like that. And my input's incorrect. Okay, so what input is incorrect? What false assumptions am I predicating conclusions on? TI Tool accepts being corrected. TI Tool is fine with being corrected. I'm perfectly capable of being corrected. I'm not hating on ESFPs, Jade. I'm telling you the truth about what your situation is. But I already know it's not going to do any good. My take on extroverted intuition holds water. Oh, right, because I'm an ESTP. My TE input is incorrect. The facts and system you use. That's not TE input. You're saying my TI understanding of it's incorrect. You're so TI polar, you can't tell the difference between TE and TI. See what I'm saying? That's not a third slot TI perspective. You're not valuing TI at all. You're countervaluing it. You are expressing the position of somebody who would be TI 6, perhaps, but most likely TI polar. INFJs don't feel that way about TI Tool. INFJs are quite attracted to TI Tool. You're just making random claims, Jade. You're not justifying them with any argumentation. That's why you are clearly not an INFJ. No INFJ would throw out a bunch of unsubstantiated claims like this after I've already pointed it out without adjusting it all. It just socially, you're not socially successful with that, right? And INFJs are very concerned with what's socially successful. That's just how it is. Okay. They have this A with a circle around it. Lets you indicate to whom you're talking. Hey, Roosmas. Business is fine. Your ESFJ broke up with you. You're sad. Did you really want an ESFJ? Probably not. You probably didn't really want an ESFJ. I was married to one for a long time. I was with one for something like 13 or 14 years. And let me tell you, it gets old. Okay? It gets old. Okay, fine. Email Anthrax. I will say what I always say is my official disclaimer. Until I've actually spoken with somebody and typed them formally, my conclusions are largely speculative. So you are correct, Email Anthrax, that my conclusions about Jade are speculative until I actually test her meaningfully. I've not meaningfully tested her, so I'm making a lot of intuitive leaps here that I may not be able to sustain if I actually had the real evidence in front of me. Okay, that is absolutely correct and a valid critique, Email Anthrax. So, Jade, how would an INFJ successfully critique me? Read email Anthrax 6:14 a.m. comment. That's an INFJ interacting with me successfully to correct me and be right. You'll note that he warrants it. You can't make the claim you're throwing out the baby with the bathwater. In other words, your whole basic premise here, Eric, is process-based, that it's unreasonable to draw conclusions without going through this process, and yet here you are doing exactly that. You need to check the functions before you make judgment, okay? That's a successful critique. It's successful socially. In other words, he comes across good, and it's successful argumentationally. He's right. So we can look, though. The problem is, of course, in demonstrating how an INFJ does it so successfully, it does draw quite a stark distinction between how he communicates and how you communicate. Martinell, that is so true. Tatum did not laugh, love, learn, and live. Okay? I claim to be an ISTP, but I'm still very skeptical. How would I know? I'm a definite TI Dom. Well, let's see. I will get to that question in a second. First, I want to say that Tatum, the way to have saved that relationship was to get him a wall sign that said, as far as anyone knows, we're a nice, normal couple. We actually had that sign in my house, except with family instead of couple. As far as anyone knows, we're a nice, normal family. My wife put that sign up in my house. And I was just like, what the fuck? Don't you see how that fails? Oh, well, that's fair, Tatum. That's totally reasonable. Long distance and COVID? Fuck that noise, I mean, you can't blame him for that. Uh-oh. He's ignoring your dominant function, INFP. No, Jade, an INFJ would be able to articulate why, or they wouldn't say anything. Sex made us lovers, hearts made us friends. Martin L., that is so moving. And the thing is also, Jade, if you were going to critique my system meaningfully, you wouldn't say lack of depth. That's not a problem with my system. You might say, I mean, it's like I've been working a long time on cutting away parts of my system that don't withstand scrutiny. So for people come in here all the time, right, and say, "Here's something wrong with your system, Eric," and every time they've been right, I've modified the system to adjust for their correctness. Nobody's been right in a way that's been systemically destroying yet. So in other words, nobody's been right about a problem with the foundational ideas that would cause the whole thing to collapse. But I've had to adjust a lot of things that I realized didn't make sense until everything makes sense. Okay, but see, Jade, you've got TE and TI backwards. Any TI is able to articulate arguments about why things are the way they are or are not the way they are not. You are unable to do that. That's a TI polar indication, a strong TI polar indication. You keep mistaking TE for TI. Another strong indication your TI polar is that you don't recognize it and you keep mistaking it for something else. I've done this a lot with FI. Okay, well, that's true. You are right about that point, Jade. And that's a very good TE observation. It works well also as a TI argument, I suppose, to end discussion, but it doesn't actually contribute anything to the discussion. Paris Hilton is an INTJ. So how does logic differ from rationale? What do you mean by those two terms? Do they mean something specific in your head? What's the difference between logic and rationale? So it's like for people who use TI in the front stack, when they say words, they mean something specific. So the thing is, for people who don't use TI in the front stack, and especially for people who are TI polar, when they say things, they don't necessarily mean anything specific. So when you said TI is logic and TE is rationale, you don't know what you mean. You're not sure what you mean. And that's a sign of TI polar. And it's fine. It's not, there's nothing wrong with you, Jade. I want to stress this. There's nothing wrong with being TI polar. But it makes you wrong a lot in your words here, or in a context when you're talking about TI things. TI is personal, TE is impersonal. TI is an internal framework of true-false judgment. If this, then this. TE are beliefs. Okay. TE are beliefs, but you said TE are impersonal. So what are some impersonal beliefs? Versus, you say TI is personal, but you say TI is conditional. If then, that's conditional, right? Okay, well, I'm asking you questions, Jade. So you say TE is impersonal, but then you said TE is belief. Can you give me an example of an impersonal belief? Okay, so, and you also said that, but you see, like also, you said maybe a TE user could articulate why. But then down here you say, TI is an internal framework of true-false judgment. If this, then that. So a TI user would be able to explain why then. Well, it's because if this, then that. That's an explaining why. But above you said a TE user would be able to explain why. Down here, you say TE is impersonal and its beliefs. So if you want to explain something to me, then explain it. Agreeing with email anthrax's explanation, which is much more reasonable kind of explanation. In other words, if email anthrax had said what you said, he would have known what he meant. He would have been able to say what he meant in a straightforward fashion, which he did. You were not able to. And in fact, you said multiple contradictory things as you tried to explain yourself. First, you said a TE user would be able to explain it. Then you said, but TI is the conditionality function, and you can't really understand what an explanation would be like without this fundamental conditionality aspect. In other words, if we were talking about a world in which explanations were TE, then they wouldn't use conditionality all the time to explain things. See? Do you see what I mean, Jade? If your explanation had not been full of contradictions, maybe you'd be an INFJ. Instead, your explanation was full of contradictions. That's not TI. It's not third slot TI. That's not fourth slot TI. That's seventh slot TI. Sounds pretty biased? Jade, I'm explaining to you what you said and how it contradicts itself. How can that be me expressing a bias? If you ever want to let TI make an impact on you, let it make an impact today. And hear what I am saying is true. Jade. I appreciate you coming here and helping me stay on topic indirectly. Okay? You mean you love ESTJs? You see the frustrations I got to deal with in life? This is why words matter. If I'm an ESTP, what the hell does an ENTP look like? See, as Joseph? I mean, doesn't that run afoul of everything we know about sort of the stereotype of the two types? Like, it's just. I mean, if you want to turn everything up on its ass, then I've got good sensing. My display of verbal acrobatics there is an example of good extroverted sensing. I know. Oh, but you see what the damage done by misinformation. Look at poor Jade. He's got her convinced she's an INFJ, and everything up is down and everything left is right. I don't put so much value on stereotypes, Jade. Yeah. Exactly. Thank you, Email Anthrax. And I don't know what Jim Carrey is, except I don't like him. I know that. I do not like him. Anyway, I'm not going to bother arguing anymore with Jade today. I don't know what I'm not sure what Jim Carrey is, but Jim Carrey is certainly not an ENTP. That we know for sure. Is this example right? To demonstrate how TITE works is when the answer to the question, what is the best car, contains multiple cars with the exact same performance. TE has to choose between these cars. I mean, then it's FI would choose between the cars. Because I guess the only difference then would be color, right? You'd have a bunch of cars that are all the same, so they're a different color. I mean, I don't think that's equivalent. That's right. You're talking about Rusmus's example, or you're talking about Jim Carrey. If you're talking about Jim Carrey, yeah, I don't know what type he is, and I have long said I can only speculate as to types of celebrities in general. Although I am much more confident in my speculation about certain celebrities than others. And I can only speculate about my typing of characters in stories and stuff because there's no real definitive answer on them. A lot of times characters are written with traits of multiple types. For example, Rick Sanchez is said to be an ENTP, but he's got way too much TE to be an ENTP. He is an ENTP except for excessive TE. There's no ENTP has ever been that TE, TE minded. How can TI said to be personal when it's objective and disinterested calculus, say logic deals exclusively with that which is not subjective, i.e. not personal? It's another contradiction implicit in what you were saying, Jade. You're only talking about Jim Carrey? Oh, yeah, great. Cool. He reminds you of a teacher you had who was an asshole. Jim Carrey reminds me of just something about Jim Carrey. It's like I know I would immediately be at odds with his ass. I would just immediately want to like disagree with him about stuff or whatever. How would you explain, or could you provide an example to demonstrate how TE solvency works? Yeah, I mean, it's like Rachel the other day. Usually, if the padlock in the gate is through the hole, the gate's closed with it through the hole so it doesn't latch, okay? Or if, in fact, it's pushed all the way through and it's so you can't open it, then it's usually locked, okay? So in general, the gate has two states. It has a state of being that is push openable, in which case you don't need the key, or it is a state of being which is not push openable, in which case you do need the key. However, there is a third possible state where the padlock is through the hole, the thing's in the thing, but it's not actually locked. Rachel, the other day, went to the gate, and it was in that state. But instead of using TE, instead of looking at the situation and evaluating it, she pushed the gate and said, "Oh, I can't get out." And then came back here and said, "Can you bring the key and unlock it?" And I went up there and I said, "But it's not even locked. It's just, I just pulled it out and opened the gate, And she's like, "Oh, I didn't know it was ever like that." Something like that. She said, It's just such a an NI way of knowing things without any TE. There's no attempt for her to solve the problem herself. She immediately goes to FE tool, go tell Eric. Right, TI polar is likely to say you're biased in your own TI. People project their blind spot. What is FI? How does FI polar project their blind spot? You're just using your feelings or something? I don't know. I was sleepy, happy, content eyes this morning. Yeah, I didn't really sleep very well last night. I couldn't sleep, and unwarranted claims, unwarranted claims. Thanks, Jade, for those unwarranted claims. Toodles, Tatum. Who are some fictional INFJs? Well, I'll tell you something. Your mom would insult someone's mom in City's Apple. Ask your mom's face when she cleans it off in City's Apple. Maybe she'll tell you. Thank you for pitching me the softball in City's Apple. I appreciate it. I need softballs this morning. Praises to Jaw. Jaw. Who is Jaw anyway? I want to know. Is it Jahweh? Who's Jahweh? Is that just another word for God? Or does that mean something else? Jahweh. I've heard people use the word, but I never really looked into it before, I don't think. So FE Third just doesn't care for people's moms. I mean, I think FE Third doesn't think it's really about people's moms. At least with ENTPs, it's just a joke, I don't really insult people's moms. I just jokingly insult people's moms. Jaw's Odin. Jaw's not Odin. No, that's not true. Fyug, hug, kyuk. You're shitting me with your shitting words. Know what I'm saying, dog? Jabrowski? Who is Jabrowski? Astrid the Earthling. It's nice to be among planet mates, I gotta say. I'm glad at least one fellow terrestrian is here. TI is objective and disinterested is an unwarranted claim. What are your sources? Do you even use? Okay. There is some deliberation function that is objective and disinterested. What you called logical, if this, then that, is objective and disinterested. I mean, if you want to meaningfully define those terms, objective and disinterested means specifically it adheres to logical argumentation, not what you want, right? But as though you were a third party evaluating something. So you said it's conditional. That implies that it's objective and disinterested. You should get some breakfast. I agree. It's important to eat. You're not an Earthling you wish you were. I'm from planet Earth and proud of it. I'm proud of my earthly heritage. Okay. Deliberation is a process where you have to figure out or think about or feel through until it's the process by which you attain conclusions. Okay. The process by which you attain conclusions. So note, when I am asked to remember what's the first thing I did when I got up this morning, I am not being asked to figure out a conclusion, right? I'm being asked to recall something that I know. On the other hand, if I'm given a complicated math problem, 12,402 multiplied by 6.748 plus 7, you have to spend time figuring it out, right? You can't recall the answer because you don't already know it from experience. You can't intuit the answer because it's too systemically complicated. So as a consequence, you have to figure it out. Deliberation is distinct from knowledge in the same way that figuring things out is distinct from remembering or intuiting answers. Okay, so Jade, I just meaningfully defined deliberation. So let's not move away from that point now. What ESFPs in my experience typically do, and this does not necessarily mean you're an ESFP, is ignore meaningful responses that I give to things and move on to new objections. Ah, Tom Dickelson. Is that what I do? Yeah, I guess I do that. I'm guilty. Guilty as charged. FI Polar, unable to acknowledge one's own internal motivations of spite, while concurrently spitefully attacking people for their spite, right? That kind of stings, Tom Jickelson. Would you happen to be an INFJ? Or an INFP? You gotta be one of the two. Yes, this is, what is this called? No, did you hear what I just said? This time I said the disclaimer I needed to say, so you couldn't say that response. It matters what I say. Jade, it matters what I say. Words matter. But always at the decisive points, it is oriented by subjective data. That's not true. Oriented. Well, oriented is a weird term. I mean, it's true that there's personal motivation decides where you TI sometimes, right? But I mean, that's simply saying that everybody ultimately is an individual entity, an agent whose basic interests are served, you know? So, Jade, you didn't respond to anything I said. Okay? I'm not saying this is definitive, again, the disclaimer, but that is textbook ESFP behavior. You didn't respond to a single thing I said. No matter how cogent, strong, good, well said it was, clearly true, you didn't respond to it. You didn't accept anything I said as legitimate. You didn't treat anything I said, oh, so, okay, well, maybe it's just self-knowledge, huh, Tom Jickelson? Do you see it in yourself, too, or what? Or you just see it to me? I know. Okay, well, if I did without disclaimer, I again refer to my disclaimer. It applies to it all, okay? I'm going to talk about you as you probably are, but I can't definitively call you an ESFP until I were to actually type you. You would not allow that to happen, certainly not, and have it displayed, because you would discover that you are among the type of people who is especially poor at TI. Now, or at logic, what you call TI as well. You refer to it as logic, if then, right? You're especially bad at that. Like, unusually, remarkably bad at it. And tests can prove that. A skills test can prove that. But even if I were to give you that test and prove that to you, you wouldn't accept it. you will avoid taking that test. And if I were to give it to you and prove, in fact, what I'm saying is correct, you would not accept the results. That's the truth. Even though you yourself said TI is if-then. Conditionality. You won't take a conditionality test, or if you would, you wouldn't accept the results. But do you hear what I am saying, Jade? Respond to my words. Stop avoiding them. I mean, we could test this and prove it correct right now. I could give you a bunch of conditionality questions and you would utterly fail on them. So there's no reason to continue arguing, since you yourself could falsify your own claim with a little bit of effort. I'm giving you a way to falsify my claim. Right? You can falsify my claim. Forget about falsifying your own claim. You can falsify mine. If I'm claiming you're an ESFP, you can falsify that by doing well on a conditional logic test. Where does logic come from? It's implicit to two things: grammar and the statement connectives, the meaning of the words or, and, if then, if and only if, not. Jung wasn't quite entirely right about TI. He never defined his terms subjective and objective adequately for us to meaningfully critique what he meant, I guess. He kind of gave a holistic NI understanding of things. It's kind of stuck in metaphor. So we have to clarify our definitions more if we want to have a more correct and simulatable and scientific-y model of the thing. Jung is not the end all of truth about cognitive functions. That's just all there is to it. Sorry. I'm sure he says a lot of good things, but because he doesn't meaningfully define his terms, he's not the end all of cognitive functions. Doesn't mean he may be right about a lot of things too. I mean, I'm happy to get these quotes from Winston's mom. Just as Darwin might possibly represent the normal extroverted thinking type, so might we point to Kant as a counterexample of the normal introverted thinking type. The former speaks with facts, the latter appeals to the subjective factor. That's not subjective, though. What Kant's appealing to is not subjectivity. That's the problem with Jung. Everything he says there is correct, except he calls Kant's TI subjective. It's the exact opposite. That's why it's called a categorical imperative. How much more universal can you get than that? It's insane to call that subjective. Martin L. That's so silly. We have to source the essence that our functions are listening from, and they are the songs of the archetypes. And the other thing is, Winston's mom, I don't think that Jung's doing a good enough job there of distinguishing between NETI and SETI. You know, Kant is clearly NETI or TINE, probably the latter. And he's not SETI. So it's that sort of the eternal validity of the primordial images. What the fuck does that mean? That doesn't mean shit. Primordial images. I mean, come on now. If you're trying to make arguments that refer to the primordial images, then you're just mucking around in metaphor town. All right? And I'm just not interested in mucking around in metaphor town forever. Is it possible that Jade could be ENFJ with inferior TI rather than polar? No, because she's so adversarial, right? No ENFJ would come in this adversarial. The data is objective, the judgment is subjective. Exactly wrong. The data is either subjective or objective. The judgment is objective. Okay? So yeah, I mean, I agree. Good and evil is an objective consideration, but yeah, validity of the primordial images is NI town, and that's all fine and dandy. I have no problem with NI. I like it. I think it's juicy as hell, but it's not a way to model something. Okay, that's just you're playing around with like literature at that point. You know, you've got to actually define terms in terms of that exist as an ecosystem that can be modeled, right? We know how to model an ecosystem. There are fields, objects, vectors, right? There's a grammar to the thing. Information flows this way, that way, etc., right? I'm not dumping on NI. I love NI, believe me. I'm just saying that's not a way to model something. Because to be honest, Octavia Silva, I will be perfectly honest about this with everybody. I do believe I can type ESFPs in the chat. I do believe I can. They are Cloud. They are Jade. They all respond the same way. At least there is a type of person. Maybe it's some other type. Maybe it's a Enneagram type. Maybe it's an Enneagram tri-type or something. Maybe I'm totally wrong about correlating with ESFPs. I acknowledge that I don't have enough data to confirm this strong intuitive conclusion I've drawn, but it's pretty easy to type ESFPs in the chat. You know, it's like it's this particular habit of note how Jade has come in and done a succession of critiques, none of which have been warranted by any good reasons, and additionally ignored everything I've said in response to everything she said. So there's never a back and forth. It's this quality that I've noted in ESFPs that is predominant. You can determine it in the chat easily. There's never a third step. If you say meow and I say meow meow, with most people there'll be a meow meow meow, right? It doesn't happen with ESFPs. They stop here. Then they start a new thing. Meow. Because that's SE Dom rather than it's any eighth, you know? It's not a detailed lecture. It's an observation about a specific behavioral trait that you are demonstrating very well. Like, listen, Jade, you said, please give us a detailed lecture on ESFPs. So I'm responding to that. I'm saying it's not a detailed lecture. It's an observation of a specific behavior that ESFPs do. In other words, they never follow up my response on the same argument chain. They always start a new chain. Now you're going to do that. I'm not talking about anger. I didn't say anything about anger. All right, so you just demonstrated it again. I responded on point. I said, it's not a detailed lecture. It's instead an observation of a specific behavior. That instead of responding to what I say now, you'll start a new argument chain. And then you did. ESFPs wouldn't even bother with this nonsense. They would go outside. It's a new argument chain. It's not responsive to what I said. It's this particular behavior, Octavia Silva. It's so distinctive and definitive that I think I'm quite successful at typing ESFPs in the chat, to be honest. I'll make my disclaimer because I've been convinced before and been wrong when I actually talk to somebody. I can think of multiple examples, but never with ESFPs. I'm not saying that. I'm saying I can think of multiple examples, at least two, where I was convinced that somebody was meow in the chat, and I ended up typing them, and they ended up being meow. So I acknowledge that that can certainly happen. That my conviction about people in the chat can be wrong. However, I still believe that ESFP is an exception to that because of the reason I said. It's this specific behavior of never doing that third step. It's like it's textbook ESFP. It could be cloud. That's true. Sounds the same, right? Yeah. It's just, and that's the behavior. That's the specific behavior. Not being able to get to step 3. Being internally stuck on step 2. Let me see what you said specifically. My TI is quite obviously oriented by the subjective factor, i.e. I use it or not depending on my TE and FI evaluations of situations and subjects, but the TI is only processing objective data. I'd say I wouldn't say it's necessarily only processing objective data. You can process information about somebody's feelings that you presume you still treat it as an object, but I'd say the point is it's only processing in an objective fashion. What you're processing in an objective fashion may be influenced by your FI, right? But the process itself is going to be objective. You have a bias system that doesn't look at people's functions, just your perception. Who gave me the example earlier of TI polar projecting? You're exemplifying it, Jade, with what the person who earlier gave an example of TI polar projecting looks like. It's quite the opposite. I spend an hour at a time talking to people, typing them all the time. You can look at any of my multiple typing sessions. I look very much at people's functions. I'm probably the only typologist who does, except for Spacey and Isaiah. Above that was the second part. Okay. I don't disagree with Young's statement, but to say that TI is oriented by the subjective factor does not say that it is the subjective process, nor when the process is subjective data. I see. I mean, I think that validates objectively for sure, because you're just pointing out that saying meow means meow, but doesn't mean meow and doesn't mean meow. And that's true. I mean, definitionally. So yeah, it validates objectively. I mean, obviously, people are going to pay attention to things they care about, and they're not going to pay attention to things they don't care about. So there's going to be that fundamental reality for everybody. That means in some sense that pointing out that for TI users that's still the case isn't really a meaningful distinction to make. The good and the true are not to be divided. I like that. I mean, I do have plenty of folks on other things. Is good and evil objective? Well, I would say that half of it is objective. So, negative moral prohibitions are objective. Positive moral indications and or contraindications are subjective, or if they are objective, they're objective in a way that is not accessible to human beings. Actually, I'd say FI hates FE more than FE hates FI, because FI sees FE as inauthentic and shallow. Well, I mean, FE sees FI as selfish. Look, I mean, the thing is, I would say that FE views itself as being a team player in certain slots, anyway. Maybe not in all slots, but I tend to think that FE front stack people think of good FE when they're thinking about it in a positive way as being a team player. And I think that FI people see FI as, putting what matters most first, which is, both of those things are sort of correct in their own frame. The thing is, we know that FI is not equivalent to morality, because people can take a cruel FI pleasure in doing something mean. People can be driven to revenge by FI. People can be driven to murder by FI. You walk in on your wife with another man and shoot them both or something. That's an example of people being motivated by FI to do wicked deeds. So we know that FI is not morality, that it doesn't link directly in a causal sense to morality. We do know, however, that there's a rough correlation between the good and how we feel. I mean, I think that's not an incorrect description, incorrect metaphor that Dave Superpower uses with the self-over-tribe thing. I don't think it's a terrible metaphor, but it's still just a little too metaphorical. It's self-over-tribe. Yeah, sure. I guess. I mean, I don't like the term tribe because it's not necessarily tribe always, right? FE still exists when you're just dealing one-on-one with people. So how do FE and FI compare when they're both low in the stack, i.e. fourth? Well, FE fourth plays out very differently in INTPs than it does ISTPs. ISTPs will often seem almost like FI users. They'll be very selfish from an FE user's perspective. In other words, ISTPs have the worst FE of any of the FE types according to all the other FE types. INTPs, in contrast, are kind of people-pleasy, but also not very helpful. Like they've got this weird combination of wanting to please people and being unable to be helpful. So it's odd. Although it depends. You can get them to be helpful if you got them like right there, so you can motivate them with in-person FE all the time. Everyone uses FI, but not everyone values it. That's why Hitler was an ENTP. Hitler was an ENTP. I don't think I've always said Hitler was an ENFJ. I never said he was an INFJ. I've said he's an ENFJ. I don't think he was an INFJ, although it's possible he was an INFJ on meth. That's conceivable, I guess. Because I've heard from a lot of different places or various sources that the Nazis were on meth. But I don't know if that's true or not, really. It might just be a myth. But I've typed him as ENFJ. Oh. You have the potential for FI nastiness as well, INTPs. Maybe I don't incur their nastiness that much. I don't know. I get along pretty well with INTPs. Horse Mumbler certainly has the ability to make me feel bad, and has used it, but I would say not in a spiteful way at all, but as a means of clarifying for me an area that was foggy because of my own polar FI. FI different ENTJs and ESTJs? That one's a harder question to answer. I don't feel like I know the answer to that very well. That's quite a find, Kiak. And Rusmus also confirms that they were on a lot of different drugs. So, I mean, conceivably, with enough meth, Hitler could have been an INFJ, I guess. But I say, excluding that notion, I would type him as ENFJ. I don't know what the intertype theory is. No, I don't think that's the case at all, Crimson King. I think plenty of them are SE Doms. I think Bobby Jean said sounds correct. ENTJs seem to care more and understand people's problems more, but ESTJs are more reliable, so potentially more helpful. That sounds correct. But Jade, I'm blazing up marijuana. Okay, not meth. Big difference. Enormous difference. All right, well, I'm going to wrap it up. That's about all the energy I got these days. I didn't sleep much last night. I'm not going to get my new prescription till Thursday. Today's the 31st. So, get it on the 3rd, I think. Okay, anyway, thanks for being here. Don't forget to eat plenty of cheese.